Assalamu alaikum. Good evening to everyone. My name is Ravi Mamtani. I am the professor and vice dean at the Institute for Population Health at Weill Cornell Medicine in Qatar. I take this opportunity to welcome you all to our next webinar today in our Population Health and Wellbeing series. As a reminder, the Population Health and Wellbeing series has three objectives, and they are: number one, discuss contemporary and critical topics relevant to healthcare, medicine, and population health. Number two, examine evidence-based practices germane to public health and patient care. And number three, describe opportunities and challenges in the evolving phase of population health. Before we get into the seminar, a couple of housekeeping notes. Your cameras and microphones are turned off. Please use the Q&A feature to type questions and/or make comments. Questions will be addressed at the end of the session, and that piece of the session will be moderated by my colleague, Dr. Sohaila Chima. For us to know that this activity is approved by the Accreditation Council of Continuing Medical Education in the US for CME purposes, and also by the Ministry of Public Health, Department of Healthcare Professions here in the state of Qatar for a maximum of 1 hour. So some additional housekeeping notes insofar as certificates of attendance are concerned. One, that the post-activity evaluation will be available in your Cloud CME by May 22nd, 2022. You will receive an email notification once the evaluation is available in your Cloud CME account, and that your certificates will be available for download once you complete the post-activity evaluation on the Cloud CME portal. Now to the webinar. The topic for today is scientific misconduct, a roadblock on the evidence-based medicine pathway. And to speak on that topic, a complex but a fascinating topic, is our colleague, our friend, a long-standing collaborator, Weill Cornell Medicine-Qatar, Dr. Albert Lowenfels. So I just want to take a couple of minutes to introduce Dr. Lowenfels. Dr. Lowenfels is Emeritus Professor of Surgery at New York Medical College in Valhalla, New York, USA. And he's also Professor of Family Medicine at the college. He has published over 280 peer-reviewed articles in just amazing journals. He has been a reviewer of the Journal of American Medical Association, British Medical Journal, Nutrition Cancer, Cancer Research, Pancreas, and Gastroenterology. That speaks volumes about Dr. Lowenfels' interest in science and research. He's also the associate editor of Pancreatology. His publications have been supported by National Institute of Health in the US and by the Smithers Foundation. The focus of his research has been on disease prevention, public health, the relationship between benign and malignant disease, pancreatic diseases, cystic fibrosis, infectious diseases, and health determinants of disease in Middle East population. So you can see the amount of experience that Dr. Lowenfels has, as I said earlier, in science and research. So with that brief introduction, please join me in welcoming Dr. Lowenfels on a virtual podium. So Dr. Lowenfels, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us this afternoon. Good morning for you, of course, in New York. And we are grateful to you, and we really appreciate your time. With that, over to you, Al. Thank you so much.
Dr. Mamtani, thank you so much for the kind introduction. Dr. Mamtani was with our Department of Family Medicine and Preventive Health for several decades. And when he left, it was our loss and Qatar's gain. We're going to talk about an unusual topic today, and it is how fraud is a potential roadblock on the evidence-based medicine highway. Now, as health professionals, we all want to practice evidence-based medicine. But what happens if some of the evidence is false? And that's going to be our topic. So we'll see the next slide. So here's a disclosure statement of nothing to disclose, no unlabeled products. And here are the learning objectives. We want to estimate the frequency of scientific misconduct and classify the types of scientific misconduct, and then finally analyze some risk factors leading to scientific misconduct. Why does it happen? And can we prevent it? This is a dramatic representation of the topic, and it emphasizes two themes. One is that scientific misconduct can be dangerous, and it can kill people. We'll have several examples of that. And the second thing, equally important, is it can be difficult to prevent, and we'll spend some time discussing prevention of scientific misconduct. This is an outline of what we'll be talking this afternoon. We want to define the topic, give you some specific examples, and then discuss the magnitude of the problem and some predictors of fraud. We'll mention the U.S. Office of Research Integrity. There are similar offices in other countries. We'll talk about some time trends. Is it getting worse or getting better? Some consequences and ideas about prevention. And then towards the end, we'll talk about why is there fraud? We don't really have a good answer to that. And then we'll end up with conclusions. So here's a definition of scientific misconduct. It's from the U.S. Office of Research Investigation. We'll talk more about that later. And research misconduct means fabrication, falsification, or plagiarism in proposing, performing, reviewing research, or in the reporting of research results. So it's fairly broad. And similar terms are scientific misconduct and fraud. And since fraud is a one-syllable word, and it's much easier to say, I'm going to be using fraud throughout the presentation, but you'll know it's scientific misconduct. And then part of the definition is zombie publications. I don't know if anybody is familiar with the zombie publications, but these are publications reporting results on experiments that were never performed. It's just completely false. So if we use the term zombie publications, we'll know what we're talking about. Now, PubMed, which is the wonderful database that anything that's been published and reviewed is listed in PubMed. And these are some of the search terms. If you use any of these search terms, you will come up with the topic we're talking about. So whether it's scientific misconduct or fraud or any of the other terms listed here, you will come up into the same group of articles. And that's very helpful. So mesh terms are extremely useful in PubMed. They're really great. So what organizations or groups are concerned with fraud? So in the US, we have the Office of Research Integrity. It's mandated by Congress about 3 decades ago. In Europe, there's the anti-fraud office. Every university has a research integrity officer, and they carry out initial investigations. I'm sure you have exactly that category in Doha. And then journals are particularly interested in recognizing and responding to suspected fraud. And then I think the most important category is readers. And most cases of fraud are originally spotted by readers. And how did they do that? It's because they could not reproduce the results originally published. So readers, and we're all readers, are the most basic level of fraud prevention. So here are just some basic statistics. The median time from publication to retraction is a little over 2 years. And about a third of the retracted articles have been cited within 3 years. Even though they were false, they've been cited. And methodology, statistics, or whatever you want, accounts for a small fraction of retracted articles. And that implies that fraud is the main explanation for the majority of retractions. And repeat offenders, and we'll see that, account for a large proportions of retracted articles. So if you're dishonest, you're likely to do it more than once. I'm going to start with a really horrible example of fraud. This happened at our own medical school, New York Medical College. And it was a report about cardiac regeneration by a physician who was a member of our basic science faculty, Pierre Anversa. And he published an article that said, bone marrow cells regenerate infarcted myocardium. It was published in Nature. That's one of our leading journals in the year 2001. It had over 7,000 citations, so really a blockbuster article, and it is still being cited. Here's a citation from just this year about an article that was published 20 years ago, and it's been completely false. So let's see exactly what went wrong here. So this wonderful researcher, he was recruited from our school, went up to Harvard, and we were all shocked because we thought he was going to be the backbone of our basic science research department. But in 2018, in other words, almost 2 decades after the original report, Harvard University retracted 30 Anversa public papers using cardiac stem cells to repair the heart. The reason was that his fraudulent results could never be reproduced. And the university repaid $10 million in grants to the government. Furthermore, it set back stem cell research by a decade, and there's still reverberations. And the feeling is that this was a zombie trial, a zombie report. It was just never done. He just wrote up some numbers, published them. They looked good, but it was a zombie trial. So what's the follow-up for Anversa? Well, one major trial which used cardiac stem cells to help patients with chronic heart failure has been halted in light of the clouds surrounding his work. He lost a major lawsuit against the organizations questioning his results. And he disappeared, at least I think he's disappeared. I could not find any more traces after moving to Switzerland, where he founded the Swiss Institute for Regenerative Medicine. So regenerative medicine is a hot topic, and he was responsible for a lot of the interest in this topic, but he has just gone and disappeared. So he was the villain of fraud, and here is the hero of fraud detection. It's John Carlisle. He's an anesthesiologist in a small hospital in the southern part of the UK. And he published an article in 2021, last year, titled False Individual Patient Data and Zombie Randomized Controlled Trials. And he reviewed articles submitted to the journal Anesthesia to see how many of them were fraudulent. So let's take a look at what his finding. So this is a massive job. I don't know where he got the time to do all this. He reviewed all 526 randomized controlled trials. And remember, randomized controlled trials are supposed to be the very top level, the very best thing you can do. He reviewed over 500 trials submitted to Anesthesia from February 2017 to 2020. And based on his initial review, 14% had false or untrustworthy data. 8% were considered zombie trials. He then wrote to the authors and obtained the actual data from 153 of these trials. And after that review, about 40% had untrustworthy data and 26% were zombie trials. They were just never done. This was a huge shock. So what are the implications of the Carlisle trial? I don't know if anybody is aware of this work. Here's my take on the implications. Are these high detection rates limited to anesthesia publications? I don't think so. I don't think anesthesiologists are any more honest or dishonest than people in other fields. And Carlisle also found that JAMA and New England Journal of Medicine publications also had fraud in other research areas. And he questioned whether making the actual data available rather than just the tables reduced the risk of fraud. And I think that is true. And now when you submit an article, the journal will say, will you have the original data available if anybody wants it? And you have to say yes to that. So that has been one step that's been beneficial. And here's a disturbing editorial that came out just last year from the British Medical Journal. It was an editorial. And in this editorial, it reports that about 20% of clinical trials are just wrong. And few of these trials have ever been retracted. And the problem is particularly severe for systematic reviews, because if you have one fraudulent trial in a systematic review, it throws the whole thing off. You can't really mix fraudulent and honest data together and come up with anything. And retractions are only a small fraction of untrustworthy studies. So most of the untrustworthy studies have never been retracted. And the next point was that our current system incentivizes fraud. It's so important to get something published. If you're in a country like China, your whole career depends on getting something published. So that is a big incentive for fraud. And the final point they made is that peer review is not designed to uncover fraud. Now, I do a lot of peer review, and I think about fraud. And if the data looks just completely wacky, I'm going to make a comment about it. But it's not something that's the first item that I think about. I tend to believe that if somebody is reporting something, it's likely to be true. So here's my homemade decision tree for detecting fraud. So the first thing is the article that you're looking at, has it been peer reviewed and is it published? So if it's been peer reviewed, it could be true. If it's not peer reviewed and it's just published in some magazine or whatever, it could be fraudulent. And then the next cut point is whether it's been replicated or not replicated. If somebody else has taken the same idea and done a similar experiment and has replicated, able to come up with the same findings, then it's the report or the idea is likely to be true. If it's not been replicated, you have the possibility of fraud. Now, there are other causes. Somebody just might not have thought it was worthwhile looking at it, and that happens. But if it's not been replicated, you have to look and see whether it's been retracted in PubMed. Now, there is a whole category of articles that are listed as retracted. And if it's been retracted, it's probably fraud. So that's one approach to fraud detection. Now, I want to look at some of the actual statistics for fraud. And the retraction rates, this is a project I did just using PubMed data, and these are retraction rates per 100,000 publications. And you can see the retraction rate varies by region. I'm not exactly sure why that is. It could be that it depends on the number of people in the regions. It's not adjusted for the basic background population. But Europe, North America, Australia, South America, they seem somewhat lower than the other regions. And this is another way of looking at the problem. It's the number of publications, retracted publications per 100,000 by the type of publications. And you can see that the leading cause of randomized controlled trials. I think the reason for that is that these are usually done to check out the validity of the effectiveness of a treatment or a drug, and they're often done by pharmaceutical companies, and there's an awful lot of money invested in the outcomes. So wherever there's money, that's incentive for potential fraud. Meta-analysis is very high, and as we said before, if you mix together a fraudulent with a true result, you're going to have a big problem. Multi-center trials, and down at the very bottom, case reports, nobody's going to report a single case that's just fraudulent. There's no benefit in doing that. So we have to be especially thoughtful about randomized controlled trials. And this looks at the topic from a different viewpoint. I've looked at it from the area of medicine. So if we take all areas with a retraction rate of about 29 per 100,000, that's the reference. But cancer, it's almost twice as much, and it's highly significant. And cardiology is increased. Infectious disease is decreased, and COVID-19, well, it's only been 2 or 3 years, so it's really too soon to say anything about that. But the findings with cancer and cardiology, again, these are big trials, often for drugs. Cancer is therapeutic often, and these are areas where somebody could be tempted to report fraudulent data. And this is quite interesting. It looks at retracted articles. The articles have been retracted from PubMed from mean time to retraction. And these are times in months. So for fraud, it's almost 4 years before the article was retracted. So they've been sitting around there. People have been reading them for 4 years for fraud. For other causes, it's much shorter. And other causes could include just simple mistakes like the journal got the tables mixed up, or the author recognized they did a statistic that was not quite right. And so they contacted the journals, and there have been retraction for other causes. But fraud, 4 years before it takes a while to detect fraud. In the meantime, people are out there reading and using these for evidence-based medicine. I don't know if any of the members of the audience are familiar with this organization. It's a private organization, Retraction Watch. It is a key organization, and I subscribe to it. It comes into my mailbox every day. It's voluntary. You can pay a few dollars if you want, but it's completely private. They have a huge database, and it is the database that most people interested in the topic are using to study fraud. And you can look it up by article, by the journal it was published in, by the authors. It's an absolutely astonishing database run privately. This is just an example of one of the editions that comes in every day to my mailbox, and you can subscribe to it. Worth doing. I strongly recommend it. The final one over there, the cello and the nightingale, that's the most interesting one. It was faked in 1924. There was a wonderful cello player who used to play outside, and every time there was a nightingale that would sing along with a cello player. It was so fascinating. The BBC wanted to put it on television. They got everything all set up, but the nightingale was so frightened by all the heavy duty equipment that the nightingale did not sing. But fortunately, the BBC had a whistler that could imitate the nightingale. It was completely fraudulent, but it took almost 50 years before they. Anyway, that's an example of the sort of thing that comes in with Retraction Watch. It's a goldmine of information. Here's a report that came out just this year in the Journal of the Medical Library Association. They looked at a large number of publications in pharmacy journals. And most common causes for retraction were data falsification and data manipulation. And these retracted articles have been cited more than 1,000 times. So in just this one area of pharmacy, there's a huge problem with fraud. A very revealing article. I don't know if, I'm sure many of our readers and listeners today are familiar with the Theranos case. This is a portrait of a photo of Elizabeth Holmes. She killed a lot of people, really a lot of people. And she was convicted earlier this year of fraud and crimes. And here's the story. In 2003, she founded a company called Theranos, which she claimed was based on a machine that could supposedly run more than 200 tests on a few drops of blood. She had a deadly fear of withdrawing blood by a needle from a person's vein. So she thought that a machine that could do it just fingertip blood would be really exciting. And she convinced several large drug companies. She would just look at the donor with her beautiful blue eyes and say, give me your money. And many, many people did. She collected $1 billion. She had a company with 800 employees. But the truth was, this machine never worked. And not only that, it gave faulty results, because if you take blood from a fingertip, you have to kind of squeeze it a little bit, and it just takes something simple like a potassium level. They turned out to be much, much higher. And this was extremely dangerous because many of these people were on dialysis, and potassium levels are important. So based on the results of this machine, they were giving all kinds of wrong advice to the patients. So just this year, she was found guilty of fraud and deception. She's going to go to jail. There's an appeal coming up. The original idea did not have peer review. She just published it in some magazine. Everybody got interested in it. But this is really an outstanding example of a dangerous, dangerous result of fraud. There's a whole book about it, if you want to read it, written by a Wall Street reporter. Very good book. So this looks at time to retraction in cardiac in cardiology publications, and it looks like the time to retraction is getting a little bit shorter. But many of these retractions were just for technical reasons, and now it's a little easier to pick those up, but it does seem to show a downward trend. Now, let's say a word about the US Office of Research Integrity. It's been in existence for 30 years, and its aim is to detect, investigate, and prevent research misconduct, a wonderful goal. It responds to complaints about whistleblowers and to action by whistleblowers. If you're a whistleblower, you're in a sort of an anomalous position. People don't like whistleblowers, and so the Office of Research Integrity responds to complaints about them, and it provides technical support to institutions that suspect fraud. But this is the discouraging thing about the Office of Research Integrity. If you look at all retracted Medline publications, and there are some 9,000 retracted Medline publications, and in the last 5 years, the Office of Research Administration only reviewed 26 of these retracted publications. That's a very, very small fraction. That means that most of these retracted publications have never been reviewed by the Office of Research Integrity. So it is a valuable organization, but from my viewpoint, there's a lot more work that needs to be done. And this looks at retracted publications in cancer research. This is a little different from the previous slide I showed, because this includes retractions where fraud was identified. So over time, it seems like there've been more retracted publications, and that fraud was responsible for about 20% of them. Let's talk about COVID-19 and fraud. So already more than 200 COVID-19 patients have been retracted. And that's, again, from Retraction Watch, the the organization that I mentioned. Two of them came from high impact journals. One came from Lancet. One came from the New England Journal of Medicine, and both by the same author. And these articles have been shared by millions of readers and followers, including health professionals. So it's too early to tell about COVID-19 and fraud because it's only been a few years, but we'll expect many, many more. So whose job? I don't think it's the reviewers. Editors, certainly. Authors, if they find that there's been a mistake, they should report it. I think readers are the key group. We're the ones that are affected most. We're the ones that are taking care of patients. And so we hope that this presentation will give you a little bit more of an insight into it. Organizations certainly are, and journalists have a key role to play. So why is there fraud? It's a complicated issue with multiple causes, and I don't think we have the real answer. Deception could give you a survival advantage. In this complicated world, and in the medical world, there's a survival advantage if you can present something. That's certainly true in academic circles. It's interesting that deception is common in non-human species. There are a lot of butterflies that mimic toxic butterflies, just so that birds will stay away from them. I find that fascinating. And academic advancement absolutely depends on publications. It's publish or perish. We've all heard that. But it could be publish and perish. That's another way of looking at it. So, and it's increasingly likely when the chance of detection are small. So fraud is common in the non-medical areas. Everybody does fraud. You just have to look into finance, other areas. The whole, everybody does it. You know, fake it until you make it. That seems to be a common mantra. And then this final thought, should scientific misconduct be criminalized? You remember the very first slide I showed, the Anversa slide. He did this huge fraud, and he just disappeared. Nothing ever happened. He never went to jail. He could still be out there doing it. So these are some thoughts about why there is fraud and a little bit about prevention. And by some miracle, we're coming to the summary. And where you go over everything you've just said and sum it all up, you have to have a summary. So I think the first item there, it disrupts the basic trust we have in the scientific process. That's really very, very bad. And if you don't believe in science, and a lot of people in our country and throughout the world do not believe in the scientific process, how are we going to get anything done? Career advancement is dependent on publication record. If you're an academic person, that's really true. We don't know the true extent of fraud, but I think it could be as much as 20% of published reports. That's much higher than I thought before I began this project. And failure to reproduce results is the commonest detection mechanism. So if somebody cannot reproduce your results, you have to think this is fraudulent. And detecting fraud is much more difficult than producing fraud. And we need better methods for preventing and penalizing fraud. There's got to be some way we can make it discourage people from doing it. And the final point is, if the results are too good to be true, they're probably false. So that's my presentation for today, and we have time, a few minutes left for questions.